You know, like a lot of people, I am very outraged by this act of federal expansion. I really can't believe that the executive branch, in conjunction with its underlings in the legislative branch, could come up with something that is so restrictive and restraining upon our personal liberties and our own civic responsibilities as individuals. Of course, I'm talking about the Second Militia Act of 1792. Surely you are aware of the Second Militia Act of 1792, right? Passed May 8th, 1792. Well, if you're unfamiliar with it, it was an act of Congress, the federal government, that said that all able-bodied males ages 18 to 45 were required by law to enroll in state militias. And as part of these state militias, they had to provide for themselves, out of their own pocket, a musket, a bayonet, a belt, 2 spare flints, a cartridge box with 24 bullets, and a knapsack. And if you owned a rifle, you had more expenditures. You have to go out and buy some powder horns, a quarter pound of gunpowder, 20 rifle balls, a shooting pouch, and a knapsack. I wonder if like that year there was a really sort of a surplus of knapsacks in the Washington area. Maybe that's the whole point. But anyway, it was a law that was passed and enacted, and it was active for quite some time. In fact, it actually from this spawned the idea of the National Guard many years later. As part of the law, a couple of people were exempt. Ferrymen were exempt. Oddly enough, congressmen were exempt. Yeah, I know. Imagine that. Legislators making laws that don't affect themselves. Boy, I'm glad we don't have that anymore. And the general idea was if you did not comply, you were subject to being court-martialed, and since this was the late 1700s, God knows what they would do to you in a military tribunal. So anyway, this is really, really relevant because obviously we have the big Supreme Court Obamacare decision coming up. And there are many activists out there that are saying that in U.S. history there are no precedents for the federal government requiring individuals to own or purchase a service. Well, the Second Militia Act of 1792 is a clear-cut example of the federal government requiring its citizens to own or purchase something. So obviously there is some sort of precedent there. So next time you talk to one of your conservative or hyper-libertarian friends, tell you that never in history has the government authorized something of the like, they have. Additionally, this stuff happens all the time on the state and local level. For example, I live in the wonderful, wonderful state of Georgia, and we have a law in place that says that if you own a motor vehicle, to operate it on the state's roads, you must also own a form of automobile insurance. So that's an example of the state forcing an individual mandate on people, saying that you have to own a certain product or else face a penalty. Even better, I live in a city called Kennesaw, Georgia, which in the 1980s passed a city ordinance saying that all head of households in the area must own firearms and a certain amount of ammunition. Of course, it was a non-enforceable mandate. It was mostly a symbolic one, but it was passed nonetheless. So right there we have 3 examples on the national, state, and local level of political bodies passing, authorizing, and to some extent enforcing the idea of an individual mandate in some regard. So of course this brings us to the big Supreme Court decision, which will be coming out at the end of the month, and clearly this is the biggest SCOTUS decision since, probably since Bush versus Gore. So obviously this is going to have gigantic implications on American society for a long time to come. And in fact, there's actually a lot of legislators that are trying to get the Supreme Court for the first time in history to actually televise the hearings. So obviously there is going to be a lot of attention. I'm going to be glued to my TV set for the entire procedure. If that happens, but it's never happened before, and they probably won't do anything for the Supreme Court. But before we get into the merits of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, we must talk about the Supreme Court case itself. Because you really don't hear much about the actual case, and trust me, this will win you a bar bet later on, so pay attention. The name of the case in question is called Thomas More Law Center versus Obama. And the guy who actually is the petitioner on behalf of the Thomas More Law Center is a guy named Robert Muise, M-U-I-S-E, who is part of something called the American Freedom Law Center. Now, I'm not here to kind of, sort of rankle any chains or fluff any feathers or get any sort of conspiratorial things brought up. But I want you to go to Google and I want you to type into the query box Thomas More Law Center and the American Freedom Law Center. I want you to do a little bit of research, at least check out their web pages, because it's clear that they have a certain activist bias. In other words, they are extreme, hardcore, conservative Christians with a huge pro-life bias, and they're the ones that are actually filing this big anti-individual mandate clause petition. So just to let you know, the people that are pushing for this are not exactly the most biased advocates out there. Something to kind of keep in mind. So anyway, let's talk about the individual mandate itself. What does it mean? We've heard so much about it. Guys on Fox News say it's going to lead to euthanasia. Guys on MSNBC say it's going to lead to a socialist utopia. But really, what does it mean exactly? Now, the actual Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is a massive piece of literature, and I haven't read the entire thing. In fact, nobody's read the entire thing. If you run someone tells you they've read the entire thing, they are lying. So basically what we have here is I've done as much research as I can, and this is basically sort of a summary of what I found. We're cutting through all of the myths and fabrications and actually getting down to what Obamacare actually means in its current incarnation. Now, of course, I'm just talking about Obamacare as it currently stands, because as we all know, legislation could pass next month. They could totally alter the makeup of the bill, and who knows what might actually end up. But just as it stands today, before the Supreme Court decision, this is what the individual mandate is and how it could possibly affect you. Essentially, the individual mandate would affect people that are currently uninsured, and more on that demographic later. According to the bill language in its current incarnation, an individual who can afford health care is described as a person who is enrolled in the minimum policy, more on that later, and that minimum monthly insurance premium would not exceed more than 8% of their monthly income, and they also make above the poverty line as far as annual income goes. So, to repeat, individuals who can afford pardon me, I swallowed a butterfly earlier. People who can afford health care according to the bill language. You're enrolled in at least the minimum policy. The cost of that minimum monthly policy will not exceed 8% of your monthly income, and you have to make more money than the annual poverty line. So obviously this is affecting a pretty good amount of people, except that 80% of the U.S. population is expected to have health care by 2014 that is not federally issued. So make of that what you will. So that's what the individual mandate is. That's who it would possibly affect, and like I said, we'll do the demographics later. A lot of people have been talking about what the penalty is. If you don't enroll in the healthcare service, what happens to you? Well, it works out a little something like this. In 2016, if you don't comply, if you don't sign up for the minimum federal healthcare initiative, or you don't have health insurance from some tertiary agency, you will be assessed a $695 fine or 2.5% of your annual income, whichever is higher. So that will go into effect 2016 if the Supreme Court upholds the bill and it is passed and gets enforced. So starting in 2014, you will start getting tax return forms, and on those forms you will be asked to list your source of insurance. So you're asking yourself, okay, well, what if I'm not enrolled in Obamacare and I don't pay the fine? What happens? Well, let me tell you what happens to you, buddy. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The current bill language says that under the law, there can be no criminal action or no liens assessed against you if you don't pay the fine. Now, of course, the government can always go in there and actually enforce that, but under its current incarnation, you get assessed a fine, but you don't actually have to pay it. If you don't pay the fine, guess what? Nobody comes after you. You don't go to jail. You're not even forced to pay. They don't even take it out of your taxes under the current legislation. So all the hubbub, all of the rhetoric, all of the anger and frustration is basically over something that is currently written, cannot be, and will not be enforced by the federal government. Imagine that. Alright, so you're probably asking yourself, what is the scope of Obamacare? Well, there's an organization out there called the Urban Institute that released a report saying that at most, Obamacare could potentially affect only 26 million uninsured people in the United States. Actually, it's a lot less than that because they break it down by saying, well, out of the 26 million uninsured people that could possibly be affected by Obamacare, about 9 million of them could enroll in Medicaid, 9 million others could possibly enroll in public subsidies for their health coverage, which means that at absolute most, the number of people truly affected by the individual mandate clause would be about 7 million people, which roughly transfers out to about 2% of the U.S. population, or 3% of the population under the age of 65. So all of the incessant coverage and anger and outrage is over something that would affect 7 million people. Yep, that's what we come down to. Oh, pardon me for a moment. A little parched. Also, I read a report from the Kaiser Family Foundation that said that out of the 26 million uninsured people that could be affected by Obamacare, as many as 24 million of them could possibly be exempt from enrolling in the program. So there you go, that's even lower numbers than what the Urban Institute had addressed as far as whom would actually be affected by Obamacare if it were to pass. The Congressional Budget Office in 2010 estimated that by 2014, 80% of non-seniors, so that's about 270-something million people in the U.S., would already have non-Obamacare insurance. So clearly this is not something that's going to affect the majority of the U.S. population anyway. And something very, very ironic and kind of funny is that this Obamacare, this liberal socialist program forged by Hitler and the devil, is actually based on policy created by conservatives in the 1980s. Yeah, the Heritage Foundation. You got guys like Mark Pauley and Stuart Butler who are actually pushing for Congress to adopt a very Obamacare-like program during the Reagan years. In fact, the Heritage Foundation, they helped Mr. Mitt Romney in 2006 come up with the health care reform law in Massachusetts. So, life is funny. Okay, and lastly, if you're wondering what all this hubbub is, what exactly the Supreme Court will be doing, what are they trying to figure out with this case, is there's this thing called the Commerce Clause, which says that the federal government has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. So basically what the Supreme Court will have to do when they make the big decision is they're trying to answer this basic philosophical question. And boiled down, to get away from all the rhetoric and the jargon, the terminology, what they're trying to figure out is this. Is not buying health insurance a form of economic activity? Because if it's not considered a form of economic activity, apparently the federal government cannot regulate it. So there you go. That's the big question we're trying to figure out. Whether not buying something does not constitute economic activity. Don't you wish you lived in America? We have to deal with this stuff. It's great. So anyway, a big question I've heard from a lot of people is exactly what would enrolling in Obamacare cost. Going back to that Congressional Budget Office report from 2010, the minimum individual premium by 2016 has been assessed to be about $4,500 to $5,000 per individual premium. So if you're looking at how much it is expected to cost, that's pretty much what you're looking at. I haven't really done too much research on what the other health premiums are, but I don't know. Then again, you got that $695 fine that you have to pay, so what's the point? So anyway, that's it. That is Obamacare and the Supreme Court case in front of us in a nutshell. This is what we will all be glued to our television sets watching at the end of the month. And now you are a little bit wiser. You know something that the average American does not know. So you can go in there and just look really, really enlightened, and then get accused of being a witch afterwards. So there you go. That's my public service for the day. And now you know what an individual mandate is. Spread the knowledge.